Coming to paperback and e-readers, Spinsterella Goth Girl Summer. Take a trip into the macabre world of goth modeling in the new millennium in this all-new Spinsterella story. Pre-order your copy of Spinsterella Goth Girl Summer at Amazon.com and other online booksellers everywhere. You would think that Hollywood only produces superhero movies and other blockbuster type films these days. However, Hollywood still produces movies based on original stories and original concepts. However, many of those films don't really get much press and they really don't get much traction at the box office these days. Now, the big problem that's going on with Hollywood these days is that when it comes down to original content, Hollywood really doesn't go out here and heavily focus on looking to build an audience for it, and it doesn't focus on looking to build an audience for original concepts because they're basically chasing the dollar, similar to the way an addict is chasing the dragon. And because the studio executives are heavily caught up in their tunnel vision, they spend more time focused on chasing the dollars of blockbuster franchises like the Marvel Cinematic Universe or other established franchises, or looking to go out and make reboots and remakes of previously successful films, and that makes it hard for original films to be able to build any sort of audience or get any sort of traction at the box office. Now, one of the big problems that many original films face at many of the major movie studios is that they really don't get that support as related to advertising, and that really hurts a lot of these original films at the box office. Now, many of these films are being released, and as they're released, oftentimes most people don't even know they exist, and they don't know they exist because many Hollywood studio executives don't give these films an advertising budget, and since they don't give them an advertising budget, most people don't even know when they're coming to the box office outside of seeing a trailer when they're going to see a blockbuster film at the theater sometimes. And in other cases, what happens is that many of these films don't really get any sort of trailer whatsoever, and you have to go out here and search for that trailer online. No, unlike many of the films that are superhero movies or big budget animated films or other type of blockbuster type films, many of the original films don't really get the press that they used to get back in the times of the 1980s. Now, I remember growing up in the 1980s and the 90s, and when I would see advertisements for films in newspapers and magazines, this would be something that would get me excited about looking to go see a possible movie. Moreover, I would also see advertising on television. However, in these 2020s, in this internet age, most of those mediums have basically been rendered obsolete. And as they've been rendered obsolete, what's happened as related to the people is that they're not made aware of these films. Now, I remember again back in the day, television was huge for advertising movies because you could go out here and advertise a movie by buying ad space in many time slots, especially in syndicated channels, and this could build some buzz for a movie. But these days, again, television has been rendered unpopular due to the TV going digital in 2009 because most people don't watch TV anymore. No, they migrated over to the internet, and what further exacerbates this situation is that we had a SAG-AFTRA and WGA strikes, and those strikes basically made it where TV lost 50% of their audience. So most of the audience doesn't even have a venue to where they could find many of these movies, and can't find the movies because basically what Hollywood did was, as it looked to consolidate media with the Telecom Act of 1996, it basically created a series of trends that made it much harder for a studio to be able to reach an audience with new material. That's what's happened over the last almost 30 years since the Telecom Act of 1996 was passed, it's become a lot harder to be able to reach an audience with brand new material because many people basically have become conditioned since about 1998 when Wesley Snipes revived the superhero genre with Blade to only be focused on mostly blockbuster movies and not those small original concept movies that were a big part of what made many of the blockbusters in the 1980s and the early to mid 1990s. Because I remember growing up in the 80s, and most of the films that were the biggest blockbusters were not, again, big franchise films. No, a lot of those films basically were fresh original concepts, and these fresh original concepts basically were blockbusters because many of the studios went out here and advertised these films, and as they advertised these films, people started to get a chance to see these films in the opening weekend, and then they would go out and spread word of mouth. They would go out here and spread word of mouth, and that would lead to many of these films turning into huge hits. Many of these films that were considered to be, again, no budget films like The Terminator turned into huge hits for the studio, and other films like in the 90s that were not considered to be successful, like Pretty Woman and Ghost, basically wound up building so much momentum through word of mouth that they turned into blockbusters, beating out many of the blockbusters that were speculated on, like Total Recall and RoboCop 2 and Dick Tracy in 1990. And it's a lot harder to get an original concept to get people to notice it. And one of the big problems that the studios have with trying to get a person to notice a film is because, again, we don't have that infrastructure to be able to advertise those films, and those films don't even get ad space on platforms like social media such as YouTube. That's a big problem that I've seen with a lot of the studios these days, is that they're not putting their original concepts trailers up on YouTube to go out here and build a buzz and generate some energy, because putting a trailer up on YouTube is basically free. The studio ain't gonna lose no money, but the studios don't do this at all. They don't do it at all because a lot of the studio heads basically are disconnected from reality, and since they're disconnected from reality, it's hard for them to understand how to use advertising to go out here and build buzz for a film. I mean, you could just go out here and use things like the official Facebook page or the Instagram page to let people know a film is coming out. You just post it up for a day, and possibly this could generate buzz. But many studio executives, again, because they're stuck in the past, don't really know how to utilize technology to build an audience. And on top of this, the other big problem with many of these studios is they really, when it comes down to original concepts, are not really producing a lot of films that don't answer the critical question that most of today's audience want answered, and that question is, why should we care? Another big problem at these movie studios is that they're not really making really good original films, because many of these studio executives really don't have that finger on the cultural pulse. And since they don't have that finger on the cultural pulse, they really can't tell you what could be a concept that could basically reach a larger audience. No, many of these studio executives don't go out here and understand what could be appealing to customers because they basically have become so complacent. What's happened to many studio executives is that they have become complacent on the whole genre of superhero movies being easy cash grabs, and since these films are easy cash grabs, many of them have basically lost their passion for the business, lost their instinct to know what could possibly be a hit, and really don't have a good sense as related to making good films, and greenlighting them, No, that's why we're having a hard time with many original concepts coming out, because many studio executives really don't have a good story sense. This is something that a screenwriter like myself has to have before we go out here and start working on a concept. Before I ever even think to start working on a concept, I have to have a good story sense to understand, is this story something that's marketable? Is this story that's going to be something that's appealing? Is this story going to be something that's going to be commercial and reach a larger audience of people and be relatable to a larger audience of people? Is this story going to be something that appeals to a larger audience? And that's something many studio executives, they haven't cultivated as related to their skills. And that's basically turned into a trickle-down domino effect, because many filmmakers really don't have a good sense of what it takes to make a good commercial screenplay. That's what I'm seeing that's very different from the 1980s and the 1990s. In the 1980s and the 1990s, people had a good story sense and a good awareness of the culture. And because they had a good story sense and a good sense of the culture, many people could go out here and know what to pick and as related to greenlighting concepts, and that would lead to them being able to greenlight an original concept, and that concept going on to become a box office hit and be a film that people could go out here and care about, because it was a story about people. And since it was a story about people, people had a reason to care enough to want to spend money on films as related to watching movies. And that's another element that really is a big problem. A lot of people don't really know how to tell stories about people in a compelling way. I've watched a lot of these newer films, and one of the problems with these films is that, yes, they're shot very well in some cases, but there's no spark, there is no heart, there is no soul. There's nothing there that connects to people. There's nothing there that connects people to answer that critical question, which is, why should we care enough to go out and spend money to go to the theater? Why should the audience care? That's the question that many of these newer filmmakers have not learned how to answer. They have not learned how to answer that question of why should we care. And since they have not learned how to answer the question of why should we care, many of these newer films are flopping at the box office because they feel very dead, they feel very uninspired, and some of it has to do with the concepts that are being greenlit. Some of it has to do with the whole way that they are being shot by cinematographers who really don't know how to create a shot that really creates a compelling image. And some of it has to do with the uninspired way that the director has basically told the story. I mean, some of these directors, again, they really don't have those skills to be able to tell a compelling story on screen, and it's affecting the business. But this is par for the course, because when it comes down to the whole business of movies, the whole business of movies, I believe, has wound up stagnating as a result of an over-reliance on superhero movies, an over-reliance on the digital effects that are in superhero movies. So the craft of American film, what has happened to the craft of American film is it's basically wound up withering, and wound up withering due to a lack of use, because like muscles in bodybuilding, you have to keep working them out to keep them in shape. And when it came down to American cinema, the Marvel Cinematic Universe and many of these other blockbusters and franchises have basically led to those muscles as related to filmmaking withering for Hollywood. It's led to it withering because in order to keep those muscles strong, you have to continue making fresh original films. And you have to continue making fresh original films, because fresh original films allow you to hone your craft, develop your skills. And what's happening now is that Hollywood is sitting there wondering what's happening here. And what's happening here is all part of a natural process. When you don't use a muscle and you start trying to use it once more, you got to go through a process to get it back in shape. And when it comes down to Hollywood original films, again, this is something you're going to have to do to get back in shape. And what's happening here with Hollywood, because they're so addicted to cash grabs, is that they basically don't want to go through this process of making original films like they had to do in the 1960s and 1970s after most of the audience basically walked away. After most of the audience walked away from the baby boomer generation because they were disconnected to the epic movies, the World War II movies, the movies about classic literature, and the movies that were basically made from the 1910s to the 1950s. I mean, the whole process of film had to go through a process as we transition from the star system and old Hollywood to new Hollywood. And as we are in this new era, we're transitioning from the new Hollywood era of the 1970s to a new era of film. I would call the tech era of film or something like that. I mean, we're transitioning to a new age, but sadly, many of the executives, like the executives of the past, are really resistant. And since they're resistant to change, what's happening is that people aren't not able to go through that natural process where they have to reconnect to film. And that is further exacerbated by the audience basically waiting for everything to go on streaming. Now, Hollywood bet a lot of money on streaming, believing that streaming would be the next big technology change as related to film. However, what happened with streaming is that while all these venture capitalists poured all this money into the content, and all of these other types of people like these hedge funds poured a lot of money into this content, again, that content really did not catch on because they had oversaturated the market. And since they oversaturated the market with so much product that was really of poor quality, many people they don't have an incentive to go to the theaters. And this basically created a habit within people where they were not incentivized to go to the theaters, partially due to the pandemic, partially due to jab mandates here in places like New York, and partially due to high prices. Most people these days really don't want to take a risk on original concepts because they wait for streaming, and as they wait for streaming, they're doing this because they don't want to pay the price that is higher for a movie ticket, or even pay the price for home video, which basically has been, again, discontinued by many of the studios in favor of streaming. However, this basically led to a lot of the studios winding up losing lots of money, especially when their blockbuster superhero movies fail. They wind up having to lose lots of money because they basically destroyed their entire distribution system. And as they've destroyed their entire distribution system, most people are now waiting for streaming, and in some cases only paying $3 to watch a brand new movie, and they're paying $3 or even $7 to watch a brand new movie, whereas under the old entertainment system, they basically would have paid $15 at the theater, another $20 to watch that movie on home video, and then would have possibly watched it on cable, paying more money for the cable service. They would have, again, paid for this movie 3 times, and the studio would have reaped lots of profits. Unfortunately, due to studio greed, what has happened is people no longer are going to the theaters. There's no way for them to access these movies to own them on home video. They have no reason to watch television, and they're cutting the cord as related to their cable. And because most people have migrated over to the internet, they're watching these movies that cost over $50 to $100 million on most of the streaming platforms, and they're watching them for either $2.99 or they're watching them for free. And this is all due to, again, studio executive greed as they create a covert contract. Where what they're looking to do is hope to get this person to, again, spend money. They're actually costing themselves money. And as they're costing themselves money, they don't see how their whole business is encroaching on itself to the point of implosion. And encroaching on itself to the point of implosion because there's no space for an original concept to basically find an audience. There's no space for an original concept to find an audience because the entire studio infrastructure basically makes it where these films can't find an audience because there's no advertising, there's no way to advertise and reach the customer because the customer no longer watches television. And since the customer no longer, or the viewer no longer watches television, they basically can't find new movies, they can't find new concepts, they can't find anything. And the only way they actually discover these movies is if it's on streaming, and that usually is a process that again takes about 6 months to a year, and sometimes nowadays these days takes a month because the only way people find these movies is due to streaming. And that's one of the reasons that I say that Hollywood is going to have to sacrifice streaming if it hopes to save its business, because people can't find your movies because the streaming services basically are encroaching on your business, and they're encroaching on your business to the point where they're taking away your profits. A lot of these people in Hollywood think, oh, I can go out here and keep this streaming service, but the streaming service, again, people paying $2.99 if they can get a deal, or paying $7.99 to get a deal, or they pay $14 and they watch more than one movie. So instead of people going to the movie theater 4 weeks in a row or 4 weekends in a row to watch different movies, they sit there and wait for all the movies to come to streaming, pay one price, and if they can get a deal, get to watch 4 or 5 movies for free. And many studio executives lack the critical thinking skills to see where they have killed their business. They have killed their business because what they don't see is, again, you can't get people to be in the theater to watch an original concept, and they can't get the word out about original concept because they have basically destroyed the entire infrastructure for the distribution of movies, destroyed the entire infrastructure for the distribution of movies with streaming. Now, streaming was a great way to get money from platforms like Amazon and Netflix, but sadly, the studios were so greedy, they created their own streaming services, but don't really know how to distribute content. Again, that muscle as related to the business is not a strong muscle because many of these folks have become so dependent on superhero movies, so dependent on stuff like the MCU. In this consolidated whole media world, they've become so dependent on these superhero movies for box office that they don't know how to go out here and compete. Again, I talked about this in a live stream. This is what happens when you become complacent. When you become complacent, what happens is you lose your edge, you lose your competitive ability. You can't see the larger playing field as related to competing, and that's the thing that's really impeded the entertainment business. Yes, Hollywood still makes original movies, but those movies get no advertising. Those movies get little to no theatrical distribution. They can't build word of mouth. They can't build buzz. And even worse, there's nobody to make these movies a draw because, again, in this internet age, there are no more movie stars, and with there being no more movie stars, there's no way for us to be able to reach that larger audience and again have that draw that sells that movie, because many of the former movie stars, they go on social media like Rachel Zegler and start running their mouth, and as they run their mouth, they wind up killing any sort of buzz. And what's even worse is that the things that they say are carried by many of these other YouTubers. And again, these YouTubers, again, they make their money by going out here and taking advantage of this negative press. And while they make money, the studios don't make money. And they don't make money because, again, they don't know how to build buzz or generate heat. I mean, this is all part of a smart studio executive. They know how to build that buzz, generate that heat, and build that energy and get people excited. That's what a good executive knows how to do as a part of a comprehensive advertising plan. That's what I do right here on SJS Direct. I mean, about 90 days to 60 days before I launch a book, like I did with my recent catalog of books like John Haynes' A Thorn in My Side, Esteemed Season of the Witch Girl, and Spinsterella Goth Girl Summer, I'm running ads in front of my videos to let people know these books are coming out. or when they're available. Again, I want to build that buzz. I want to generate that heat, get people excited. And moreover, what I do is make videos to further promote these books, to get the word out about what's in the book and talk about subjects revolving around the book. Again, I look to again show my expertise on the subject and again get people excited about things because I understand my job is to answer that critical question for the audience of why should they care. And that's the big problem with Hollywood. We've got a lot of apathetic executives who or complacent executives who've lost their ability to compete, and they don't care, and it shows on screen. It shows on screen that they don't care, and since they don't care, it's hard to get into their movies. It's hard to get into their movies because they didn't take the time to answer that critical question. Because I recently saw a whole lot of people talking about this Robert De Niro movie that flopped at the box office. That's never been heard of, but it flopped at the box office because, again, they didn't know how to answer that question. That's something you've got to do in your even before you make your film, even before you make the trailer, you have to answer the question, why should we care? Even before I put fingers to the keyboard, I've got to answer that question of why should we care? Why should the audience care? And if you can make the audience care, you can build the buzz to generate the excitement and generate enough buzz. Again, this is something that smart business people know how to do, but many studio executives don't know how to do anymore. And since they don't know how to do this anymore, what happens with many of these films that are original is that they basically are not heard about, similar to what happens to many print-on-demand books. What happens to many print-on-demand books that are independently published is many people don't even know these books exist because the authors don't know how to go out here and generate buzz or generate heat. This is something I know how to do because, again, I use the tools like YouTube and social media to try to get whatever buzz I can get started, try to generate whatever heat I can go out here and start. And again, that's what Hollywood is lacking because many of these executives have lost their spark, they've lost their passion, they've become complacent, they've become fat, and they've again lost their edge similar to what happened to Rocky Balboa in Rocky 3. Again, they've achieved these accomplishments of billion-dollar blockbuster films, and basically this has made them fat and lazy to the point where original concepts die on the vine because if the studio executive doesn't care enough to go out here and advertise that film or generate buzz, then there's no reason to care. And again, this happens here in the movie business, just like it happens in the auto business. The auto business has the same issue of not being able to make people care because you've got complacent people at the top. And again, these complacent people at the top basically don't have a care about original films. They only care about what is going to be a safe bet for making money at the box office in a business of risk, because Hollywood's whole business is risk, and most of the money is made on a risk. Most of the rewards for the business of Hollywood came from taking risks on movies like The Godfather, taking risks on movies like Star Wars, taking risks on movies like When Harry Met Sally. I mean, I miss those type of movies, those people movies like When Harry Met Sally, movies like Fatal Attraction, movies like Ghost, movies like Pretty Woman, movies like Clueless. I mean, these were bread and butter movies for the studios. I mean, these were the bread and butter movies for the studios as related to them making money. And the studios no longer make these movies because many of them don't know how to reach people, because they don't know how to make films about people. They don't know how to make films about people because they have no connection to people. No, that's the sad part about film these days, is people have lost their connection to people. And that's why it's hard to get an original concept to be greenlit. That's why it's hard to get an original concept distributed. That's why it's hard to reach an audience with an original concept. I mean, it's really sad that we cannot reach larger audiences with original concepts, because I believe that we do have great stories to tell here in the 2020s. And again, many of the kids that I'm seeing, many of the Gen Z, many of the Generation Alpha, they want films like this. They want stories about people. They want movies about people like I grew up with, like Hollywood Shuffle and House Party, and many movies like Last American Virgin. They want stories about people. They want stories about life. They want stories about real life. They want to see their stories told. They want to see their stories again presented like that. And that's why they're going back for those films, because they want stories about people. But the people in Hollywood, sadly, are old and out of touch. Old and out of touch as related to connecting audiences with fresh material. And since they're disconnected, this is why we're having a hard time reaching new audiences, with new films. We're having a hard time because many of these studio executives, again, seem to be, caught up in tunnel vision as related to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, a universe that's taking people away from the world of film, a universe that basically is taking us away from the life going on in the real world. And that's what people want to see in film. They want to see a snapshot of life made in a way that basically tells a great story, and people want those type of films, but it's a learning curve to try to reach those people. That's what happened in the 1960s and 1970s. The studios had to deal with that learning curve, making small budget films, and again, making small budget films to the point where they were able to reach audiences in the 80s and the 90s to start making blockbusters once more. And now we have to go through this process once more, but many of the people in Hollywood, again, are disconnected and out of touch. And since they're out of touch, they don't know how to touch people with their films or tell stories that resonate with a large enough audience to make the next generation of classics and blockbusters. Now, if you want to check out many of my stories on the SJS Direct imprint, you can find many of my books, like my screenplay books, all about Marilyn and all about Nikki, the Fabulous First Season, on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. And you can also find that TV series all about Nikki in digital format at other online booksellers like Draft the Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and big box retailers like Walmart and Target. And if you want to check out many of my original concepts on the SJS Direct imprint, like my Black Goth series, the Spinsterella series, which consists of books like Spellbound, The Legendary Mad Matilda, and Spinsterella Goth Girl Summer and Spinsterella, you can find those books along with other original concepts I've done, like The Temptation of John Haynes, Black sorority novel The Thetas, and my Black business novel, A Recipe for Success, a romantic comedy. Or you can check out many of my fantasy books in the Isis and Esteem and John Haynes series. And you can also find these books in other online booksellers like Draft the Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and big box retailers like Walmart and Target. And if you want to check out how I would do comic books, you can pick up my comic John Haynes at Death's Door on Lulu.com, and you can get that comic for the same price in paperback as it was on the 2022 Kickstarter. And if you want to see me talking about the entertainment industry and taking the entertainment industry to the barbecue, you can drop a donation to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Coming to paperback and e-readers, Esteem Season of the Witch Girl. The aspiring angel takes on a wicked teenage witch in this action-packed, all-new Esteem series adventure. Pre-order your copy of Esteem Season of the Witch Girl at Amazon.com and other online booksellers. Now available in paperback and e-readers, John Haynes, A Thorn in My Side. The man who rules the world takes on an agent from the CIA, from the Black Boule, in this all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get your copy of John Haynes' A Thorn in My Side in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.